Hi, my name is Krishona Martinson, and I'm a professor and the equine specialist at the University of Minnesota. And today we're going to talk about how to physically evaluate hay. And there's really 6 things you need to know when you start to evaluate hay. The first thing is, you can see behind us we have several different bales of hay. Look at the entire bale. Cut open several of them and then take a flake of hay. So take that flake from a bale. The first thing I want you to do is pull it apart and smell it. So don't be afraid. Obviously, if you have allergies, be careful. But pull that bale of that flake of hay apart, and then I want you to smell it. The hay should smell fresh. It should definitely be free of any dust, mold, or off-putting odors. Again, it should just smell like dried hay, kind of like dried, cut grass. So again, the first thing you're going to do is smell it. And this is critical because horses are very sensitive in their respiratory tract. So any kind of mold or dust is an irritant, then they can start to cough and have other problems. So once we've determined that the hay smells good and is free of dust and mold, we're going to want to just feel it. Stick your hand inside that hay. Is it rough? Are there things that prick your fingers? We want to rule out any kind of thistles, any kind of coarseness. It should be soft and pleasant to the touch, and this hay is. And that is because horses' lips and tongues are very, very sensitive. So if you put your hand into a bale of hay and it scratches you, it will definitely scratch the horse, and the horse will be less inclined to eat it. So again, we want hay that smells good and is soft to the touch. The other thing is just use your eyes. What color is the hay? I personally do not get too hung up on color, but obviously a nice, bright green color like this hay is more visually appealing to us as owners and caretakers, and represents hay that is more energy dense. So it's also more appealing to the horse. So hay that has a nicer, greener color, the horses will eat it more readily. They'll be more excited to eat it. And of course, when you're feeding horses, you want them to eat that hay really well, be excited about that hay. But again, this hay isn't perfectly green. There are some little brown stems, and that's okay. That just means that it took longer to dry, and the sun is a very powerful bleaching agent. So the longer that hay was in the field, it just becomes a little bit more bleached. So although color is important, it isn't something I would use to reject the hay. It's just something to take note of. Obviously, if the hay was very, very brown, it would probably also smell bad, and we wouldn't want to feed that to horses. The next thing I want you to look at is what is physically in the hay. Of course, we're really concerned about toxic plants. So when you look at the hay, this hay is a combination of alfalfa, which we can see here, and also orchard grass, which is this long bladed species. So obviously grasses have long linear leaf blades, and legumes like alfalfa and clover have 3 leaflets that we call a trifoliate leaf. And you can even see some little purple buds here of the alfalfa flower. This is critically important to know what's in the hay, because if it isn't grass or legumes, it's weeds. And we want to be incredibly careful that the hay we're feeding is not full of weeds, especially poisonous plants, where we will have a 0 tolerance for any kind of poisonous plants. And we will cover some specific poisonous plants later. But again, legumes and grasses are desirable species to have in the hay. The last thing we want to look at is to just get a visual estimation of the maturity of the hay. Hay that is really mature will have big stems. So here is a blade of grass that is much more mature. The stem is thicker, the leaf blade is wider, it's more mature. Also in this hay, though, we have some blades of grass that are less mature. They're very fine. This is important to some degree because hay that is much more mature, so bigger stems, more flowers, will be less palatable to the horse, or the horse will be less excited to eat it. On the other hand, hay that is less mature, so smaller stems, less flowers, less grass seed heads, will be more palatable to the horse. The horse will be more excited to eat it. So to recap the physical evaluation of hay, you want to make sure that the hay is free of any dust, mold, smells, any off-putting smells. You want to make sure that it is somewhat a green color, although the green color isn't something you would use to reject the hay. You want to know what's in the hay simply to reject any hay that has poisonous plants or other weeds. And finally, you just want to take note of the maturity and know that hay that is finer, softer, will be more readily consumed than hay that is coarser, more mature with larger stems. So at the animal import centers in the U.S., most of the hay that is imported is from Canada, and it is pure Timothy hay. In that region of Canada where most of the Timothy hay is coming from, there are a few weeds that you need to be able to identify in the hay. The first one is Hoary Alyssum, and this is one that is really only found in the northern part of the U.S. and also Canada. So if you are in Miami, for example, this is not a weed that grows in the area and a weed that you're probably not familiar with. This weed is a problem because when horses accidentally ingest it in the hay because they can't differentiate between the weed and the hay, they actually become very swollen on their legs. They'll have temperatures. Another word for leg swelling is edema. And their legs become so swollen and sore that they'll lay down. They'll become recumbent, again, meaning that they lay down a lot. Sometimes the hay will also, or eating the Hoary Alyssum, will also progress to a form of laminitis, where you'll feel warm hooves, a digital pulse. They just won't look right. And this usually occurs within 24 hours of ingesting this weed. So because it's a very fast occurring weed when the horse is ingested, and you see these symptoms of swollen legs, sore feet, warm hooves, that digital pulse above the hoof, it is something you really want to look for. So here we have a plant mount. It has a petite white flower with a grayish-greenish stem with very small oblong grayish-greenish leaves. However, the one thing that you can really notice are these oblong seed pods. And these seed pods are what usually gives people a clue that something's not right. So when you are physically evaluating the hay and you see something that isn't a legume or isn't Timothy, you need to ensure that it is not Hoary Alyssum. And again, here we have a full-sized plant that was cut off at the ground. So you can see it's anywhere from about 1 foot to 2 feet tall, and you can see the hundreds of seed pods on the stems with these small white petite flowers. And again, it's very common in the regions where Timothy is grown in the north part of the U.S. and also in Canada. The other weed that you want to be aware of doesn't cause the horses a toxicity per se, but it's a physical problem. So this one is hard because it can be very difficult to tell apart from the Timothy hay that the horses are fed at the import centers. So here we have some some stems of Timothy. And here we have the weed that we're concerned about, and this is foxtail. So foxtail is an annual grass, and the seed head almost looks like a bottle brush cleaners with bristles on it, where Timothy, our desirable grass that is fed, does not have the bristles. Unfortunately, these bristles become lodged in the horse's soft palate of their mouth, and you will almost get ulcers or cold sores that appear in the horse's mouth. This will cause the horse to go off feed and become sick. Now, we usually have a little bit of allowance of foxtail because it's not a toxicity that will cause them like an acute toxicity issue where they have swelling of their legs, but this is more of that physical issue of getting those ulcers in the soft palate. So a few stems of foxtail is not a problem. A lot of foxtail, more than 10%, will cause a problem in the horse. And again, it can be very difficult to tell the difference between foxtail and Timothy. But again, we have some really good close-ups. Remember, your Timothy does not have the bristles, where the foxtail has these long bristles, and the bristles are what become lodged in the horse's soft palate. So fortunately, there aren't too many weeds that we need to be aware of, that is coming from northern U.S., southern Canada. But again, Hoary Alyssum and Foxtail, which cause two very different symptoms in the horse, are ones that we need to make sure of our hay is free of. So some common questions people have when feeding hay is how much hay to feed. Usually we want to feed horses 2% of their body weight each day in feed, and that includes both hay or pasture, forage, and also any grains that you're feeding the horse. So for example, if you would take a weight tape and measure or estimate the horse's body weight, and for easy math, let's say the horse weighs 1,000 pounds. So 2% of 1,000 pounds is 20 pounds. So if you have a horse coming into an import center where you feed them strictly hay for the time they are there, you would want to feed that horse, that 1,000-pound horse, 20 pounds of hay a day. Usually the horses are fed twice a day, so you could feed 10 pounds in the morning and 10 pounds in the afternoon. So again, use a weight tape around the horse's girth to estimate their body weight, and 2% of that weight should be fed in hay, and you can divide that hay meal up into 2 equal meals. So again, that 1,000-pound horse would receive 20 pounds of hay a day, 10 pounds in the morning, 10 pounds at night. The other question we get, and is it's actually kind of a problem for horses that are being imported, is we want to slowly transition them between any diets. And of course, when we are importing horses, sometimes we do not have the luxury of knowing the nutritional history of that horse. So I think it is best to do is when you pull the horse off the plane, to look in their box. Were they fed grass hay? Were they fed alfalfa? Maybe there's nothing in there, so you can't tell. But if the horse appears to have been fed grass hay, you'd want to maintain them on grass hay while in quarantine. If the horse was fed a legume or an alfalfa, ideally you would maintain that alfalfa diet while in quarantine. But again, sometimes you don't have the luxury of knowing. In that case, it's probably best to feed them a grass hay, or maybe even a mixture of the grass and legume hay if we see the legume in the shipping box of that horse. But the biggest question is, why do we want to transition diets slowly? Horses' guts have evolved to consume and utilize high forage diets. That is why we feed them a primarily hay-based diet. The microbes in the guts are very specialized. So they are specialized to either digest grass hays or alfalfa hays, for example. When you make a transition very abruptly, say the horse was consuming grass hay and we switched them to alfalfa hay, the microbes that were consuming the grass hay no longer have a feed source. They actually die off. When they die off, that produces a toxin, and that is what is absorbed in the horse's system, and that is what causes them to have colic-like symptoms and diarrhea. The alternative to that, to avoid our risk of colic and diarrhea, is to transition the horse slowly over a 2-week period. Obviously, in quarantine, you only have 3 or 5 days, so you want to keep that diet as similar as possible. But when we slowly transition them, what we see is that those microbes can slowly adapt to the new diet over time. We don't have that massive die-off. We don't have that massive release of toxins that causes the horse to be sick. So again, just to recap this session, it's this question, you just have to observe. What is the horse being fed in the shipping box? Try to match it as closely as you can. If you don't know or there's nothing in the shipping box, you'd want to stick to hay, or just to the grass hay. So the final question is, and this is really a labor question, how often should you feed the horses? Horses have an incredibly small stomach compared to the rest of their digestive tract, so they're designed to be trickle feeders. They're designed to be slow grazers. Well, when you're in quarantine, you don't have that luxury. So one possible solution is utilizing a hay net, a slow feed hay net with about 1 1/4 inch shaped diamond openings. This slows the horse down. In research projects that we have done, feeding a 10-pound hay meal on a stall floor, the horses consumed it in about 3 hours. When you put that same hay meal into a slow feed hay net, it took the horse over 6 hours to consume the same meal. So that allows them that trickle natural feeding while in quarantine. These hay nets can be disinfected because obviously in quarantine disease control is our primary concern. So that is one, that is just one thought on how to extend their feeding time and also help them perhaps overcome some boredom while in quarantine. The other option is to feed them 4 or 5, 6 times a day, feeding them very, very small meals. But because of labor, that is usually a very, very unrealistic expectation. So again, we can strategically use these slow feed hay nets to slow the horses down, help them overcome boredom, but more importantly, extend the amount of grazing time that they have.